I don't know if it's just weather that's keeping people away, or.
Well, nobody wants to get caught in the rain like it was right after services this morning. Everyone's like, getting out of here. I want to get home.
That's okay. I just converted the van to C mode. So, all right. So we'll jump into it. Then we'll see where we land. There's Doyle. Because this will be the transition into the transmission section, which is we have 4 steps. Inspiration is God's source to person's hand to page. Canonization was making sure that we had all of that, which was put to the autograph. An autograph is the term for an original document. Transmission is going to deal with the process of how they copied and kept those documents through time in the original languages, and is going to come into play as it starts to move in some others as well. And then translation is going to deal with the thread from the Hebrew/Aramaic and Greek to what we have today. Now, translation gets truncated a bit because I can go in all sorts of different directions with that, but I kind of focus on, English, and I don't get into all the different Catholic versions, various things. So I can if people really, really, really want to know, because believe me, that was the area. I spent 3 hours just on translations from the King James to the Revised Standard, so I can go for a while. Anyway, today we're going to talk about languages and writing materials, kind of set the stage for understanding how these things were done. Some of this is going to be things we already know, but you just want to kind of just establish the set, and then we'll talk about the methodologies. And the first chunk is going to talk about languages of the Bible. And before we just get into language, we can ask the question, why choose written languages? Okay? God could have used, and this is just a short list of elements biblically that were used to communicate with man in local sense. He could have used angels to do the whole thing, or visions and dreams, or speaking directly with man, which would be such as he conversed with Adam and he conversed with Abraham and so forth. He could use the Urim and Thummim, although that's incredibly limited. What disadvantages do each of these bring? If you use an angel, what disadvantage is there? Okay, well, he's saying that you'd have to have bunches of them going around all the time, imparting various, but they're messengers. That's their role. Well, again, it's inefficient when it's like a 1-to-1 ratio. And then, Eric, you had credibility?
Yeah, I mean, just the fact that, Satan's straight, angels followed him. There's all that situation where you got to know that it's valid.
That's true. And what is the most common claim of a false prophet in the time that passed afterward? I got it from an angel. It's interesting how that all works out. So I put down efficiency there, even though I kind of slaughtered it. Anyway. Visions and dreams can work to a point, but again, visions and dreams a lot of times tend to have a more prophetic element, and they're still subjective. They're either focused to the individual from their perspective, what's to come, or it's meant for someone else, but it's still subjective. Like when Daniel interpreted the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, it's still focused from his perspective. It's kind of stuck in their particular point. You want.
I have lots of dreams, but they're not. They're really weird, but they're not from God, and I don't profess them to.
Okay.
If that's the way he communicated.
We're going to come back to Eric's weird dreams. Sometimes, yeah. But you're right. But the point I'm making is you can have some weird things, but they're still something that's objectively true for everyone is better than trying to create subjective I mean, the information can be the same, but it's just less efficient again. Direct communication is the same thing. People claim that God talks to them, but again, it's all about making it personalized and in a written form. It's something that can be shared and it can be maintained and it can be kept. It can fit to everyone. The Urim and Thummim is an interesting one because is anyone familiar with what the Urim and Thummim were? That's
Old Testament special, you could call them rocks in a hat type of approach.
that is that's what Joseph Smith was trying to emulate with his searing stone. These were real items given to the priest class, which could be used to answer basically yes and no questions from God. Similar to when they would cast lots and then they would take the one that fell on was God selecting it, which is fine when you're dealing with questions of should I do X or Y, and especially in their particular situations they were moving along, but it doesn't really answer deeper questions about why. So it's not the best way to go. But you throw them in there because it is a biblical example of God communicating through a device, for lack of a better term. He could have used those things. He could have used a lot of other things, but he instead chose written language. And we have 3 P's, because alliteration is fun, to emphasize. There is a precision. Thoughts are more precise when they are expressed verbally. In a communicative form, oral and then written holds that form and can be carried forward. And what we'll find, I'm kind of getting ahead on languages, but each language is actually tailored very well to their purposes as well. God chose Hebrew and he chose Greek for reasons. And precision is one of them, especially with Greek in the New Testament. So you don't have to worry about a lot of different things. Propagation. So I'll go, whoop, and then propagation. Oh, I just crossed it. I'm trying to underline. It is possible to make more precise copies of written material because you have a baseline from one thing to another as opposed to doing it by memory. We're actually going to find in the process that was used especially for the Old Testament scribes, nothing was meant to come from memory nor be committed from memory. They wanted it to come from page to page because memory can fail. And that's the last one, preservation. The memory of man can fail and information can be lost. We are imperfect beings despite our intention to do so. The fact that the New Testament writers could remember and have perfect recall was because of inspiration. It's like, well, they got this, why not everyone else? Well, they needed it so they could write it down, so they didn't need to have perfect recall for everyone else because then we can just read it. And so, precision, propagation, preservation. To this room, we're like, why are you trying to prove this point? However, much of the religious world out there, more so than you might really at first think, rely on, quote, doctrinal information that is beyond what is written. They do. In terms of, you just pick different groups. You've got Catholics with the Pope and his authority. You've got Mormons with the General Assembly and the President. You've got the Watchtower Society with the JWs. But even in the, quote, the just general denominations, they have synods. They have councils. They vote on things. They go to extra biblical means to deal with their questions at some point. Sometimes they put it in terms of someone having authority to do so. Sometimes they just say, well, the Spirit moved us all. That's an interesting term. It happens in the church from time to time, which can be a little worrying, but depending on how you want to take it. But we're used to the idea of just let the Word do it, say it. Sometimes in the church we may not fully be aware of that not everyone has that perspective. And we need to not assume that everyone does and understand how to reach them and to emphasize that the written word is king here. It's what's key.
That is what is fundamentally part of the movement that established the church as we know it, the Church of Christ. Because the accuracy was so important, while there were so many others that were accepting of a more fluid interpretation of God's words. Like, well, he didn't really mean that. He didn't really mean that. This this kind of works, and it's okay.
Yeah, you want to convert it to, it's a living document in the way that the postmodern terms use it. It's the idea of, not Hebrew, it's the way it puts it, but it's kind of, it evolves to meet the needs of the time. Well, that's not how it's supposed to be. It is what is. Now, as an aside, the fact that it is the authority and people are drawn to other sources of authority and can be pulled in these directions is why skeptics specifically, but even those that are, quote, believers, but they want to attack it to reduce faith in it so that these other things can have prominence. They want to say, well, it's as well as it's translated correctly, or well as it's understood. Oh, we need to move this more, this new thing. So that's why it's very important to emphasize the seriousness of the text and the Bible itself. So, all right, so language is used. How many languages are used in the authorship of the Bible? 3. Win a cookie. I don't have it with me.
Hebrew, Aramaic, and Koine Greek.
Koine Greek. See? You win 3 cookies, proverbial cookies. Because you actually specified Koine. When we get to that point, I'm going to quiz you on what that means then. Ha! You're going to have to answer that. See? When you're bold, no, it's okay. I'm going to focus on explaining Hebrew and Greek predominantly. Aramaic is so close as a sister language to Hebrew and Arabic and some of those there that a lot of the things that the advantages of Hebrew are similar to it. And many times we really run through much of the difference. But the Old Testament, Hebrew, Aramaic, that is Hebrew there. That is, I've got the pointer inside here. Is it showing up? Okay. Needs to be read right to left. My Hebrew is nowhere close to my Greek here, but I know some of these words here. This is Shema. This is Deuteronomy 6:4. This is the beginning, well, this is the Shema. That's what they called it because it's named for the first word, and it's about the Lord being one God. And Hear, O Israel, Yahweh. This is the Tetragrammaton here, YHWH, which I'm going to put it in this direction. H. Okay. Doing this live. YHWH are the 4 letters there. The Yod and the different ones there. The Vav or Waw, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And Hatal, Hal. H. Make the consonant sounds Yahweh. There are no vowels in the language at the time, which is what these little marks are. These are later helpers. These are called vowel markings, vowel stems to help with pronunciation. Commonly, they use a and so we get Yahweh. And those vowels are borrowed from Adonai, which is the general term for Lord. This is going to become more important when we talk about how they copied things, because this name of God was so special, they would not say it. They would say Adonai instead. They would replace it with different things. They wouldn't even write the whole word with one pen. They'd change pens, and so this is that, Shema. Hear, O Israel. All right, we have 2 things here. Hebrew was very useful for the Old Testament. It's not as technically specific and focused as Greek in the New. It was more pictorial, meaning there's a lot more, and this is true of a lot of Eastern languages in general, a lot of word pictures, a lot of word idiomatic ideas expressed. They don't always translate. The nouns will use word pictures instead of general thoughts. And that adds a certain emotional quality when you're dealing with, a lot of the Old Testament deals with grand events, right? You have the creation, you have the plagues, you have the parting of the Red Sea, you have the demonstration of God's power in a physical manifestation to a physical nation that's looking forward to something bigger. But a lot of the things that even in the New Testament look back as examples, good and bad, like of judgment and of different things, are grand events, right? And so you want a language that can evoke a lot of emotion and explain a lot of those things with beautiful word pictures that don't always translate into English. So that's most likely why it was chosen. And it was the common tongue of, okay, it was the most common tongue that they used as well. Hebrew is also a personal language. I put emotional there, and I'm going to put feelings there. Those are very similar ideas. But it's described as something that's message is more felt than thought. It conveyed to the individual believer the personal revelation of God and the relationship to him. And one example is just the idea of covenant by itself. We don't really have the full oomph of what they meant by covenant even then in English. The use of testament, which has hung around for years, is terrible because that doesn't really work. Testament is dead. Covenant is an agreement. Testament's a will, a last will. But even then, it's about a binding connection to the one you're agreeing with, a connection to God, a connection to the people of that group and such. And it meant a lot to them. And that's one example of the way their language. English is a Western language, and it doesn't have quite the same emotion to it. So does that all make sense? I can become a total language nerd with the Hebrew here, but does that give you the gist? Any thoughts? All right. So then you also have Greek. And Grover used this word koine. What does koine Greek mean?
Common man's Greek.
Common. Mm-hmm.
And the technical, legal Greek.
Mm-hmm.
They had an artistic theater type Greek, and the common man's Greek. God wanted it to be understood.
Okay. And the differences between them were partly class-oriented, but they were also based on time. Writings in the 6th, 5th, 400 BC, where you have a lot of the classics, we call them, Plato and all the, Aristotle and various things, are written in what is considered classical Greek, which is a little more technical, and then they would later have different forms. Koine was kind of a blending of a more common man's vulgar tongue. It would be the way that it was used, one way it's described as the masses, or in Greek, the hoi polloi, that's used, the people. But it also became just more common over time because it was easier to use. Classic and Attic Greek came later. There's a different term for the more artistic form. They were just, they were less convenient languages to use. They were much more of a pain. You know? It's like trying to sound very grand and use a lot of stentorian language in English.
Like Yoda English.
Yeah. When you just talk like a person, and that was koine. God wanted to use the tongue that was common. Not only was it the common tongue, well, I'm getting actually ahead. Let's just say that. It was a universal language. The common tongue of commerce. And whereas nominally, under the Roman Empire, what would be the most common official language, you'd think? It would be Latin, because that's what they used in Rome, although in time they would switch over to Greek in Constantinople. But just because the government uses an official language, every place that they conquered had their own Scythian and ancient Georgian, Armenian, Aramaic, which was the common tongue in Christ's day among those people, because they'd kind of forgotten a lot of Hebrew, although the scribes still spoke it and used it. Greek was the money, is the commercial language. If you wanted to engage in commerce, if you wanted to buy and sell, you had to at least have an understanding of it, which made it very important. We can see that in other different times throughout history, when the lingua franca, the common tongue of places, French was the language of diplomacy for a long time. English has been the language of international commerce. It's starting to wane, different times. Why do you think God would pick a language that was so common throughout the world for the sharing of the New Testament?
People would understand.
But it's not his chosen people's language of Hebrew. It's a Western language from some Gentiles. Does that matter? He was also opening it up to that Gentile world too. He was opening it up to everyone else. So it fit very, very well. And whereas it's common, to make it seem like it's less fancy, it's still a very intellectual and more technically, I'm going to put here precise. It has certain technical precision. It has a certain precision that my writing doesn't have. Well, and the thing is anyone who's familiar with inflected languages, we can go over Greek, I love it, but it is far more complicated. Every verb ending can tie to a tense, tie to a person. Every noun, there's either 5 or 9, depending on which school you follow, different voices used for each noun, and it depends on how they start and how they end. And well, the advantage to that is when you're translating it. English has a whole bunch of helper words. It has a whole bunch of wiggle words that we use to go, oh. You can get a much more precise definition, a much more precise statement of what God intended for becoming a Christian, for what the church is supposed to be, how she's supposed to behave, how Christians, it has all the information there. Now, that right there is John 3:16 at the beginning. Hutos gar agapesein hotheos ton kosmon. And a quirk of Greek is when you have for, and sometimes a word we would translate as but, it's the second word in the language for some reason. These is kind of just a general tying to, well, taking over the world. For these he loved, who? The God, so God he loved the world. Cosmon. And the these is an emphasis upon it. These are because, or in order of that, and it's an emphasis. God so, we take so from that. For God so loved the world.
Or so, because that's kind of an old English kind of tag.
And it's trying to emphasize that hutos in the first, it's not something we carry forward much in modern, it's an emphasis. So very much, so importantly, these particular ones he had in mind, these are the ones he loved. Who? The world, all of them. Well, why are you being specific? That's the point. For God so loved the world. Anyway, so, yeah. Now, the Greek text here is actually in minuscule, which is a easier to read form. One of the later ones we'll get into what they actually look like in the first century. Then you have Aramaic, and I said small section of the Old Testament written in Aramaic, which has a character similar to Hebrew. In terms of what was written in Aramaic, there's a little chunk here and there, I think, in a couple of the prophets, but Daniel is probably the most famous. There's a good 3 or 4 chapters written by Nebuchadnezzar in Aramaic, which was the common tongue of the Babylonians. When the Jews were in captivity, at least from Judah, those 70 years, they lost Hebrew generally, not the scribes, but the general people lost Hebrew and picked up Aramaic. So by the time they returned to the land, they had to start actually immediately then translating some chunks of the Old Testament from Hebrew to Aramaic for the people to understand. By the time of Jesus' day, if you went to the synagogue and opened up the scrolls, they were in Hebrew. So if you were to read from them and be familiar with them, you had to be familiar with that. Does Jesus do that? He does in Luke 4. He goes in and said, this has been, so he understood Hebrew. The common conversing tongue among the Jewish people in the house was typically Aramaic. So he probably spoke that. But if you were to interact with people outside of that, and the language of commerce, as we said, was Greek. Possibly, if you interacted with the Roman officials, you'd have to learn Latin, though if they're in your area, they probably know one of the other ones. But what that means is it's very likely that Jesus was at least trilingual, if not more. And he was a carpenter's son. He wasn't a, quote, he's the son of God, but I'm saying he wasn't a trained man of letters. Most of his contemporaries, they may not have known Hebrew as well as he possibly did, but they would have at least known Aramaic and Greek and been at least bilingual. Sometimes we give the impression that people in ancient times were not smart. That's not fair. All right. We good to this point? Okay. Now this is just more kind of general information on writing materials. And this, I kind of just have to kind of impart information. Short of having like a show and tell stuff that's really hard to get to show and tell, I'll have a picture of a couple things, or like one set of things. There's only so much. So in terms of writing, historically, it's been said that there were 3 stages of development for common forms of writing, and different languages branched in different ways. Originally, you would have what were called pictograms, and a pictogram would be classically like a hieroglyphic, okay? But the idea is that you have a picture that's meant to convey an object. So if you had like something like this, what do you think that is conveying? Okay, the sun. What did you say? Pineapple. It's a reach. Okay, the sun. Pictograms. And a lot of times we found a lot of hieroglyphics, and we go with them, and we'd say, okay, this means the sun, and this means the sun god, and this means this is the pharaoh, this is some guy, da, 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 da. In between, well, actually, I'll do the third one, because phonograms are what we're most common, what we're familiar with. If I were to say sun, you have sa, you have a phonogram, a figure, a letter, something that stands for a particular sound or a diphthong, a mixture of letters. What gets interesting is somewhere in the middle, and this is where translation was having trouble with hieroglyphics until the Rosetta Stone and various other things, is they started to get into this realm of ideograms. Now, an ideogram uses a picture, but it's not necessarily describing an object, it's describing a concept. And this kind of branches more into the Eastern or the Far Eastern languages, where you'll have more pictogram-ish, like in Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and so forth. So I could draw this again, but instead of the sun, I might need heat, or day, or light, or bright. It's more of a concept-driven thing. And you can see where that can get, as time goes on, it gets a little tricky. By the time of Moses, letters, or phonograms, were used in writing. The big controversy for years was the belief that Moses, in 1500 BC, could not have authored the Old Testament because it took much longer before, hundreds of years later before we got to phonograms. We didn't have any examples of that. We just had hieroglyphics. They just used pictograms. They just used ideograms. That wasn't the case. The problem was that's actually untrue, and they dug some stuff up. For instance, archaeologists have dug up what they called the teachings of Kaghamni from 2700 BC using phonograms, and that's pre-Abraham. The Sumerian flood narrative, 2100 BC. It's a flood narrative about a flooding of the entire earth. Every culture has one. And from about 2100 BC, that's around contemporary with Abraham, a little before. Abraham's around 2000. Phonograms, using letters. Now, a lot of the ancient Sumerians, they would use like a triangle-shaped stylus, and they'd make imprints and then draw lines, but they would make letters out of them. The Ebla tablets, that was a famous one, 2300 BC. They were digging around in a tell, and they found this kind of a basement area where it had been covered over time, and they found all these clay tablets. There had been a fire or some sort of thing above it at some point that had hardened them like a kiln, and then they got covered and saved. And they started digging around, and they found, letters. They got like annals of kings, and they got boring stuff like shopping lists and just lists of stores and it's just stuff people wrote down. So. by the time of Moses, phonograms were used. However, consonants only. All the consonant sounds. Vowel sounds were either learned from just learning how the words are pronounced, or they had a different method of keeping them. They all followed the a-ba-g form. Anyway. Materials. There is a picture of some differing materials of what would be used for, that's probably later for more papyrus writing and various things. You'd take a reed, you would cut it down to a point, and they would use these different forms. Material is used in terms of what they would write on. Clay is an early form. Clay tablets are found. Clay tablets are not the most efficient thing to use, but they're cheap because you go and dig it up. But clay tablets were brittle, and they only survive in really dry climates. In the East, Middle East, it wasn't that hard to use them, and they would use a clay tablet, and seriously, they'd use a tool that we call a stylus, and they would, and they'd sit there with the iPad negative 1000, and they just go and do their thing. Because we just kind of borrowed the same terms. Stone was another material used. You think of a famous example of stone being used to write something on? 10 Commandments. How many times? Twice, because remember, Moses got mad, and then he broke all 10 Commandments at once. It's an old joke. Come on, guys. It's an old joke. That's an old preacher joke, yeah. Stone, and there's a couple other examples of that with not altars. Well, I mean, a couple altars, but monuments they would put up in different things. But in terms of something, if you're going to write something of length, stone is not the most efficient way to do it, because if you're going to work on stone, you got to use a chisel, and you got to have time. But they were sometimes used. Papyrus. Papyrus is what we'll find a lot of the New Testament earlier writings written on, and some of the later codexes where they create books out of them. Paul actually talks about using parchments as well. Papyrus was made from taking dried reeds, and we found evidence of the Egyptians using this almost as far back as 3100 BC, so long, long time. You imagine the process involved with this. You're going to make some old school, it's like homebrew paper, right? You take some reeds, you flatten and dry them out, and you lay them out in a row, and then you'd lay them cross-hatch into kind of a stack, and they used a means to kind of a certain gum to make them sticky in form, and they would harden up. The advantage to papyrus is you could use both sides. So that's why they could then take them and they would tie them up into a book, which we call a codex, in a binding form. And they would have kind of a book. You can use both sides. It was kind of a form of early paper. However, it was a more involved process to make versus using vellum or parchment or leather that kind of all fit a similar realm, which are skins of animals. Parchment by far is the most common. Vellum would come from antelope skins, parchment from sheep or goats, and leather from cows, cows and bulls. You could use any of them. Parchment tended to be the most useful in terms of it took the least amount of work. Leather was hard to write on because it wouldn't show up as well. Vellum was very, very nice stuff. The antelope stuff, you had to hunt antelope and get it. And in time, even years past into like the Middle Ages, you'll find some of these early, these medieval Bibles in vellum, where they're the ones that they spend a lot of money on, and they are very intricate in their drawings and different. They're more of a work of art, which is cool, but they're not meant for the masses. Parchment was usable and most commonly used for a lot of the Old Testament writings because they had a lot of access to goat and sheep. They didn't have as much access to reeds all the time, except for when they were in Egypt. What's the disadvantage to using leather skins? Okay. Animal skins, parchment skins. What? They would, but so would the papyrus. So would anything to a certain point. Well, I guess the hint, and I didn't really lead this correctly, the hint is when I said about the papyrus. What could you could use papyrus on both sides. You couldn't on parchment because of the way it bled through the process they used. It tended to get messy. So what they would then do to preserve it, instead of folding it, you don't fold your maps, it's like that thing, they would roll it. Hence why you would end up with a scroll. Because they were using animal skins, dried animal skins, to write out these things. And they didn't want to use the backside as well as they rolled it because it would smear. So they'd only use the front sides. You can, depending on the animal and how many you stitched together and how they connected them, you could get a pretty long scroll. So you could go for quite a ways versus papyrus that you'd have to keep adding pages. But they each had their advantages and disadvantages. Now, how do you write on these things? Well, you have the stylus, which was this thing, was more just kind of a shaped carved stick. And like I said, they tended to have ones with points or sometimes triangular points, because you could do a lot with that, where you could make an impression in clay and then pull. And that's how Sumerian was done. So you'd make these triangle points and then pull. And much kind of like calligraphy, where you have like the wide edge and the short edge, you can do some different things. A stylus was used with clay a large part of the time, but if you were going to use papyrus or one of the skins, you tended to use ink. And ink wasn't easy to come by. You had to get it from squids or they had some differing sources. Yeah, actual squid ink, and they had different other sources similar to the purple dyes that Lydia would use. Very, very expensive. You didn't want to spill it or lose any of it. So you get an inkhorn. That's what this is basically meant to be. It's an inkhorn where you keep ink together, and then you'd have a place to put your tool. This is carved out, and that would be kind of a cover you'd put on it so you didn't lose any of it. And then you'd get a reed, is mainly what these are, or a light stick, something that you could, it needed to be pliable enough so that you could draw across it and it not just snap, but firm enough to where it wasn't, it had a certain tension that you wanted. And you would get a penknife and you cut it down to your point, dip it in your ink, and go along. And you might think, well, that's not too bad. That's not too bad. It's not too far off of writing instruments of just a couple hundred years ago, really. Yeah, quills. We didn't have ballpoints and various things. You get good at it. When we continue, we're going to find just how serious you had to take that. Because you're going to find that if you make more than a couple mistakes, you got to restart the entire process. Mm-hmm. And what's fun with Hebrew is they did it right to left. Now you can imagine, not a lot of them were left-handed. And maybe they had left-handers, I don't know, because you would be going over yourself all the time, maintaining the exacting control. Remember, I'm just going to go back to Hebrew here. That little tiny letter there, this one here, the yod, it's not very big. It's just a little, when Jesus talks about, well, in the King James, a jot and a tittle, it's talking about that little letter or a part of a letter. And they would use these tools to do that. Now we might think, why would you do this? Why would you do this to yourself? To preserve it? To keep it? They didn't know any different either. This is how you wrote. If you were a man of letters, you learned to do this. It meant writing wasn't just some process that some of us are terrible at. And they don't even teach cursive anymore, right? You were to become a man of letters, not only learn to read and write, you had to learn precision and skill. Because you weren't just writing for yourself, you were writing for others that would be judging your work.
And also, we're talking about the word, so you have to be completely accurate.
And yeah. There's certain rules they had to follow. That's where we're heading. So. I know this has been kind of an info dump one for this, but again, short of, I just don't have access to like ancient reads to necessarily, but you get trying to give the idea here. When we were in school and we went through this process, the guy that was assigned this section, because each of his students got assigned a different section to teach, he tried to give us something to do with a toothpick and like some like ink. That was terrible. But a toothpick was still better to work with. And he had to give us pink ink for some reason. I don't know what he had. We're trying to write something. Anyway.
I was in a thing like this, we use toothpicks and olive oil with ink with a color in it. And it smeared and it was horrible.
Yep, goes all over the place.
Yeah, you can do this. Not me.
Well, and you were responsible to maintain a certain viscosity of your ink and so forth. There's a word. So anyway, any thoughts? Well, that kind of brings us into this section. Okay. Is there anyone here that needs the Lord's Supper?
And the whole nature of the whole process is so tedious, just reinforces that it has to be done.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be. And that's the thing that blows my mind when I think all the years and all of everything just was like, no way. It has to be. That's right.
Well, and when you look at these methods and using even like a later quill system and what they did, and then you see the prospect of movable type with the printing press, with Gutenberg's press, which to us seems like it would take forever because you have to take letters and just kind of set them out for an entire page, a little bit at a time. It would take forever. And then you get one page, and hopefully everything's right. To us, it's like, do you imagine from their perspective, that was incredible. Because now they could just go, kunk, 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 and get 20 of the same page and work on the next one. And they didn't have to write them all. So we are really spoiled in terms of how we can record, impart, and share information. And sometimes I think we take it for granted. Is there anything else that needs announced? Okay. Well, then, if there's nothing else. Brady, would you close us in prayer?